So good morning, potentially, depending on where you are. It's morning for us. My name's Caylin.
And my name's Landere.
And we'll be speaking today about our experiences as well with our learning and the learning of the kids that we work with through a forest school approach. And we currently live and work in New Hampshire of the United States, and we're students at Antioch University of New England in the Environmental Studies, Environmental Education Master's Program, bit of a mouthful. And like Alex mentioned, we sort of operate our programs under the name of Tracks Forest School. And first of all, we just want to thank you all for being here. If you're here live, able to join us, we're grateful that you found the time. And for those who are watching it later as well, we really appreciate your time. And we also want to thank Libby McCann at Antioch University for connecting us with Alex for this opportunity, as well as our advisor, Jean Kayira, who's helped us put this presentation together. So we're excited to be here. So this is an overview of what we've planned to talk about for this webinar, and we'll have some discussion points throughout and then time for questions at the end. So it would be great, Alex, if you can keep track of any questions that come up throughout. And we're going to be talking about what we've been learning through a forest school approach. And some of the questions that have come up are, what is forest school? What does this look like in practice? And particularly challenging questions as well, like how can we create programs that are accessible, equitable, and inclusive? And for our situation being in the United States, in a country that's colonized, what is our role with reconciliation with Indigenous peoples as well? So, overview of what we'll get to.
So before we start talking about our thoughts about forest school, we're curious to know a little bit about what others already know. So whether you've heard of it before or not, what's one word you think of when you hear forest school? So if you're watching this live and are willing to share in the chat box, that would be great. And if not, just keep it in mind, write it down so you can refer back to it later. We're going to take a 1-minute pause so that we can do this.
I see fun.
I see spending time in forest or nature in general.
Involves dendrology.
Outdoor classroom, play, outdoor fun, observation. Those are all great. Adventure.
All weather.
All weather. Awesome.
We'll speak to that.
Yes.
Recreation,
outside, in the forest and the learning experience. Smart, intelligent play. These are all great answers. Connection with nature. Hug a tree.
All right, so
Thanks for sharing.
Keep them coming if you have more words, but we'll move on to our next slide. So forest school hasn't just come out of nowhere. It's something that's been built upon approaches that have come before it, and there's a real deep and rich history to how it's come about in the way that it has in modern day. And this history differs depending on where you are in the world. It's really unique to each culture and each place. So educating children with the land is not something that's new, and we want to acknowledge Indigenous cultures that have practiced this for millennia. And in addition, the forest school movement currently is often attributed to being inspired by countries in Europe, particularly Scandinavia and Germany. So we don't have the time to talk about all of that today, but we wanted to at least mention it so it inspires you to look into the history of your own place and country. And if you happen to be connected with the US or the UK, I actually dived deep into the history for a literature review as part of the master's degree last year. And it's in a public place you can access, and we'll send this presentation to everybody, and you can click that link to find out more about that context. So I come from an environmental education background, and before moving to New Hampshire, I actually lived and worked in England for several years. And I was working mostly for organizations that were environmental organizations that did education with school groups that would often focus on one-off field trips. And then I was introduced to forest school through a colleague, and at first it felt like complete culture shock from what I was used to. It was totally different than the teacher-directed, activity-based lessons that I'd been used to, and it took me actually a couple of years of shadowing and learning from my colleague, as well as undergoing forest school training, which is a course that's available in the UK. And after that, I started to really get it, and it's converted me to this approach because I've seen how powerful it can be, and particularly from my environmental education lens with connecting children and adults, including myself, to the natural worlds.
Yeah, nice. So I wanted to start with my introduction with my mom, because she is the first person in my life who believed that free play in the outdoors was the most important thing, more important than homework and sports and music lessons. And so I kind of grew up thinking in some ways that this was normal. And when I decided to become a public school teacher, I tried to bring this idea with me into the classroom. And as you can imagine, there were a lot of barriers, at least in the US public education system. And the absence of time that children had to just play, and especially play outdoors and make decisions about their own lives, was really missing and not given priority. I found that I wanted to listen to the children and hear what they needed from their perspective. And I didn't have a whole lot of room to do this in the place that I was. So I applied to Antioch University, New England, and met Caylin, and was introduced to forest schools, and have, I would say, 100% found my calling in the education arena. And honestly, I was beginning to give up that I would ever find a comfortable place as an educator. And now I feel like there's a philosophy out there that aligns with what I believe in.
So the variety of countries and cultures that are offering forest school now means there's a lot of interpretations about what it is and what it means. And some places have adopted principles of forest school, but these principles don't necessarily translate universally. So we wanted to offer our thoughts about what we have come to know forest school to mean to us. So we just discussed a little bit about our backgrounds and what led us to forest school, which we think represent a few lenses that people can view this work through. So from my story of viewing it through the lens of environmental education, Landere as an approach to learning and child development and education in general. And then we also wanted to include an approach to well-being, because we have come to view all of these things as the lenses you can view forest school through. And ultimately, all of it is in support of building strong and healthy relationships to ourselves, each other, and the natural world. So we wanted to offer the question of what lens or lenses do you view forest school through? Should you be interested in this approach? We're just inviting you to think about what's your why in this work. So we view forest school as an approach of ethos, a philosophy. It's more than just going outdoors as a place for learning. And there's some characteristics that we've come to feel really represent forest school and how this can make it different from other nature-based experiences. And we'll discuss all of these on the coming slides, but thinking about forest school as place-based, being outdoors on a regular and repeated basis, as being learner-led and how that contributes to holistic development, play-based, supporting risk, and educators that are rooted in the theory and practice. And how this might differ from other nature-based experiences is it's not one-off field trips, it's not classroom-based lessons outside. For example, school in a forest, despite its name. I know it's confusing. And it's not teacher-directed prescribed activities that are focused on achieving particular outcomes. We'll talk more about what this all means. So we've come to see a real significance in the frequent and repeated experiences with our learners in the same place over a long period of time. And excuse me, most of our experiences with programs that are about 2 hours long once a week for at least a few months over a year, but there's no prescribed amount of time for it to be forest school. We just have come to think that the more frequently and more often, the better. And the reason for this is it really comes to building relationships. So we've come to believe that in order to build strong and healthy relationships, we need 3 basic things. One is time to really immerse in deep play. Proximity, so experiencing changes in the natural world, being really next to it and immersed in it, and watching the changing seasons or being a part of the changing seasons. And reciprocity, so engaging in a give and take with each other as well as the natural worlds. We have a story that we think really demonstrates this idea really well. Recently, we've been taking kindergarten classes at a local public school out once a week. And before the program started, there were only a few staff that knew about a raven's nest that had been there for a couple of years, actually, in a pine tree near the school. And we started taking our group out, and we would pass the raven's nest each time. And after taking the children out just one morning per week, it was only at that point 5 weeks, so not that long, we had learned so much about the ravens because we'd seen them flying to the nest. We'd watched them build the nest, and they actually talked to us. We would have, the children would make their ravens call, and the raven would call back, and it was like we were having a conversation. It was pretty incredible. And so we built a relationship with the raven, and in our 5th week, there were some city parks, because we were doing these sessions in a city park, and there were some staff who came in and they were doing some tree work, and they needed to cut down some trees. And that included the tree with the raven's nest in it because of the way it was forked. They were worried about a branch falling off and hitting somebody, so they were going to cut it down. And we all rallied together and talked to them, and the head of the city parks department, the principal of the school, sent an email. We were considering the children were going to write letters. It was, and they decided they were going to leave the tree, at least until the ravens had finished nesting. And now the whole school is aware of the raven's nest. Some of the staff members have come out that have nothing to do with the kindergarten class, but they've come out with us on sessions. And just in the past, was it 2 weeks ago, the eggs hatched. And it was honestly like the news of the birth of a new baby throughout the whole school. It was, the announcement went throughout, and everybody got so excited. And that was just 5 weeks. So 5 weeks before that, no one really knew about the ravens or that the nest existed, and they didn't really care. That tree would have been cut down, honestly. So this was the result of visiting the same place. So being close to it, being in proximity over several weeks, that time aspect, and then having those personal exchanges, conversations, some might say, with the ravens, and the element of reciprocity.
So another aspect of forest school is that it's experiential. So we are immersed in our environment, learning through all of our senses, as the raven story really attests to. We're using our brains, as in our heads, our bodies, as in our hands, and then we engage in our passions through our hearts. And this is what inspires each of us individually, rather than something dictated by somebody else. So as Caylin mentioned, we're currently working at a public elementary school in Keene, New Hampshire, helping their kindergarten classes get outside for a forest day each week. And we're going to talk more in depth about this later. But what we're noticing is that the 3 kindergarten classes are having such different experiences and learnings from the exact same location that we go to each week. And this really speaks to the concept of emergent learning, which unfolds during real time and isn't planned by the teachers ahead of time, but can be built on later on. For example, one kindergarten class is fascinated with puffball mushrooms. And there's currently a student, one 6-year-old, who's doing an extensive research project on the puffball mushrooms, which is really exciting. Another class has been really interested in tree bark and what it can be used for. So we have been carving white pine branches and making tea. And then a third class has a complicated game of aliens going on. And all of this has emerged from the same site that we visit each week. We've also found that the outdoors place-based aspect is enhanced by and enhances storytelling. Storytelling is a really powerful tool. We have used it to deal with conflict in a group, to share information, to cultivate empathy, and stewardship ethics as well. And then we have started opening up the floor to the children themselves to tell their stories, which is always really fun and exciting, and we learn so much. So we found that the outdoor spaces provide so many opportunities to explore the world, learn about ourselves and each other, and build resilience, as we've touched on. And then when the stories come and embrace this experience, they add a layer of sacredness, it seems, to the richness of the play and the exploration, and help tie it all together to create community.
So we had formerly, or Landere had talked about the learner-led aspect and learning with our heads, our hands, and our hearts. And I think that learner-led could also be viewed as play, and that makes forest school play-based. And play could be considered a process. There isn't really a preconceived outcome to play. And I've put a definition of play according to Play England, of it including 3 things: that play is freely chosen, personally directed, and intrinsically motivated. And it's a process of learning. And in our world of structured education, this can seem really contradictory when we have a set of standards and curriculum that outline desired objectives and outcomes for us to learn, which could be considered products. So Forest School is really looking about process over product. So we wanted to pose a question to you all. We're going to put up some diagrams and wonder, for you personally, which diagram do you feel best describes the relationship between play and learning? So A is play and learning are separate. B is play and learning have some overlap. And then C is they're one and the same. Play is learning. And the hint for this is there's no wrong answer. This is a total personal philosophy. And I can see people are sharing. That's wonderful. All right. Nice. Very cool. So we'll share our answer for our philosophy. And we really view Forest School approach as play is learning. And as I've personally moved from the role of a teacher and facilitator to more of an observer, I've come to notice how much the children learn through their play, and in particular how the play contributes to social and emotional learning, how it provides opportunities for them to learn how to get along with each other, to share with each other, to communicate, to express their emotions. And this notion of play overlapping with learning is more widely accepted in my experience with early childhood. But our question is, can this be accepted for all ages? We noticed we run an after school program, and at first older children weren't signing up, even though it was available for kindergarten through 8th grade. And so we decided to create a youth assistance position that had a little bit of responsibility that came with it, but essentially we just let them play. And they did. I mean, they did, and they learned so much, and they also learned about being a mentor and leader for the younger children. So we sort of think play is for everybody. So there's no denying that there are risks when you go outdoors with children, but I also like to point out that there's risks in everything we do in life, including getting in a car, you know? So that's just an important way to think about it. And Ellen Sandsetter has a theory about how children naturally play. I don't know if anybody's heard of Ellen Sandsetter and the work. It's really useful. But the play can often involve risk, and this is actually what the children want. And through her research, she's actually identified 6 risky play types. And this link will tell you more about them, but quickly, it's play with great heights. So tree climbing could be an example of that. Play with great speed, like sliding down hills. Play with dangerous tools. Play near dangerous elements, rough and tumble play, and play where children can disappear and get lost. And I remember a particular time in a program where children were sliding down a really slippery, muddy hill, and one boy slid a little too fast, and he came to me crying afterwards. He was about 5 years old. And he described the experience to me as, at first it was fun, and then it was scary. And this actually matches how children describe their experiences with risk in Sandsetter's research, and using the word scary funny. And it's the balancing of this fear with the exhilaration. And that's actually their goal. It's how the children describe their goal. They want to find this place where there's that balance. But supporting children to take risks in the outdoors in many places is not the norm, and it can be scary for us as adults, mostly out of fear for liability in a lot of cases of what people will blame us for. So to deal with this, many places are incorporating a risk-benefit assessment framework. I'm not sure if anybody's come across that. But it involves thinking through both the risks, so what could go wrong, for example, falling when climbing a tree, and the benefits offered by the experience. So climbing a tree can build strength and stamina and balance. And this gives a balanced perspective when making a decision about whether to do something or not. And the process of risk-benefit assessment is both carried out by us as the adults and with the children, so that they're learning about how to assess risks and benefits too. So the Forest School approach gives adults a different role than what many would call a teacher. And this role is more of an observer, co-learner. I've heard and really love the phrase co-conspirator in play. So it gives you permission to play too with the children. A storyteller, like Landere mentioned, very powerful tool, asking questions and providing springboards or inspirations, but without forcing the outcome. So depending on the background and culture that you come from, this approach might require some training and learning of your own. It certainly did for me, because it was a complete shift in my perspective around my role and learning as a process. And if this shift in understanding of the ethos doesn't happen, then misunderstandings can take place, where pieces of forest school are taken and implemented and called forest school without it really being forest school. And I had an experience when I observed a program that was said it was a forest school, and they wanted to introduce tools with the kids. Sometimes tools like knives and whittling and sawing can be part of a forest school. And they had all the children sit on the ground, and one by one, they would come up and take a turn to saw a wood slice from a log and drill a hole in it to make a necklace, like a wood cookie necklace. And they had to each wait their turn. They all sat down for about 40 minutes and just waited their turn to come and saw. And it just showed me how the approach can be misunderstood if you implement the forest school type activities, but without the ethos and the philosophy behind it. So training can really help with that. And it can help with understanding risk management and just continuing professional development, not just forest school training, but continuing to learn can help you to stay up to date with the theories and practices, which are constantly evolving.
Yeah. And then I just wanted to share my story, because it's a little bit different. And I totally agree with everything Caylin just mentioned. But I, on the other hand, haven't had an official forest school training. I haven't been able to do that. And I wanted to mention this because another valuable way of learning is through finding a mentor to teach you. And this in and of itself is a totally valid form, at least in my opinion, of professional development. And so I learned about the forest school philosophy through watching and talking with Caylin and other trained professionals, and through reading and researching on my own. And especially having the mentor that I could connect with on a daily basis was so helpful. Listening to the language used for conflict resolution, how to complete the risk-benefit assessments that Caylin has talked so much about. There's a lot to learn, but it doesn't necessarily have to happen in a formal setting, unless your community has requirements that it does, and that's something you'd want to check into or just kind of be familiar with, put your feelers out about. But I think that the most important thing is having an understanding of the philosophy behind forest school. And once you have this, practicing it, and then also being willing to learn from the children while you're out there is really valuable and can teach you so much. So part of our mission to make this work inclusive, or part of our mission is to make this work inclusive. So if you don't have the money to spend, or training courses aren't accessible for another reason, I just want you to know that there are other ways of coming to an understanding of this philosophy. So we have been trying to make gratitude, thankfulness, and reciprocity a regular part of our programs. We have a routine, for example, of saying, "Thank you, Forest," in unison as we leave at the end of the session. And the children will remind us if we adults get distracted and forget, which is pretty great. We also started a good morning to the 4 directions routine for every time we go to the woods. And it's basically the first thing we do on arrival. We say good morning east, good morning south, and then go around. And after a while, the kindergartners, this is at Simon School in Keene, New Hampshire, started saying, we need to say good morning to the pine cones and to the ravens and to the trees. And so they added this whole other element in, and it's become a great way to honor all that is around us. So I just wanted to tell a little story because this is my first year working with kindergartners. I've worked a little bit more with older children, and I've learned so much from these 5- and 6-year-olds about kinship with the earth. To them, it's perfectly reasonable to ask a tree permission to pick its pine needles, to make tea, and then to listen with your heart for its answer. And it's amazing to me because they understand that that you may not hear a tree if you're listening for human words, but if you're listening with your heart, that this is another way of knowing. So I think forest school, at least in a Western world setting and maybe other places as well, does a good job of respecting this innate tendency in young children, and has the potential to motivate this attitude or way of being in the world to stick around longer as we all grow up. So quickly, one of my first observations of this with our kindergarten group was on our first day outside, and it had snowed about a foot, because here in New England, we get a lot of snow in the winter, and one child spent most of the time digging down into the snow, and suddenly he came upon some partridge berries growing under the snow, and these are plants that have evergreen leaves, so even under the snow, and little red berries, and he immediately exclaimed, "Look, we have some new friends here," with no hesitation, no awkwardness of calling a plant his friend. So the way we look at our relationship with other living things is important for the well-being of the earth. And as adults, we can learn so much from the children. So another question that we think about a lot is, how can we create programs that are accessible, equitable, and inclusive? It's a question that we keep at the center of our work and are constantly addressing, and we still don't fully know how, but we're learning each day. One of the reasons that we work in public schools is for that access and inclusion piece. Most children go to public schools here in the US, so if we want all children to have the opportunity to be in relationship with nature, we need to make forest school a part of the larger system and make it for everyone. Those are learning differences, physical ability differences, and at the same time do our best to embrace and celebrate diversity, which is also a part of creating programs that are place-based. So there's a link at the bottom of this slide to a resource that I created with the help of many amazing people to help educators make the stories that they share with learners more diverse and inclusive. And this could be stories that you're telling or stories that you're reading from a book. And then one story, again, because I think this illustrates the inclusion piece well. One of the children that I have been working with this past year would have meltdowns before going outside and didn't want to walk to the site, was really uncomfortable in all kinds of weather. This is a kindergartner again. And this is also a child who has an adult aide at his side in the classroom all the time. And I think the school environment is just not where he thrives. So what was fascinating to watch was that by the third week of going outside and doing a forest school type program, he was starting to love it and really shine. He's now inventing all sorts of things: a water launcher, a wind monitor, a slingshot. His last thing was a giant catapult that was like 10 times his height. He also loves starting fires and is helping his friends do this. And what me and the other teachers are noticing is that they're his peers are starting to have a respect for him that might not have been fully there before. And his teachers are also saying that this is one of the best things they have seen from this program, is that this child is shining. Great. So another way to make forest schools or this type of approach to education inclusive is to provide access even in urban areas where there may be a perceived lack of nature, and then finding creative ways to integrate this work into standards and curriculum-based education, which is a huge thing, obviously, in public schools in the US. And just figuring out how to do this to make it doable for teachers and break down the barriers.
And we'll talk more about our experience connecting it to curriculum in a little bit.
Yeah. And so lastly, for the access and diversity and inclusion section, we wanted to talk a little bit about our thinking in what is the role in reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. And Caylin has mentioned this a little bit. But it's something that we're actively learning about and trying to engage with. We have our own personal journey in the context that we're living in the US, and we want to acknowledge that we are both white settlers doing this work and are still learning how. So the resource that you see, I think it's to the right of your screen, is something that we have created over this past year. And it's always up for revision and change as we learn and grow. But you can take a look at it if you like once you get the PDF to this PowerPoint, and use it if it's useful at all to you in your context. We decided to create it because we work so closely with the land, and we began to realize in the last couple of years that we need to recognize, honor, and do what we can to share the many stories of the land that we are on, and not just the colonial narratives, but the many stories about the Indigenous past and current presence that is often left out of what we learn in our dominant culture. And I just wanted to quickly say that an important part of making this resource has been collaborating with an Indigenous man who lives who serves on the Vermont Commission for Native American Affairs and as a public liaison for the Elnu Abenaki tribe. So feel free to check out the resource. Okay, and so more about our work with the public school in Keene, New Hampshire. As we've said, we've been collaborating and partnering with a local school to help the teachers become more comfortable and able to take their classes outside at least one morning per week. Integrating the forest school approach was better supported in public schools because of a recent shift in educational policy, which is really exciting. In New Hampshire, as of August 2018, there's an educational policy that says that the curriculum has to be play-based. For kindergarten. Yeah. So working with the public school, we've also had to be accountable to fulfilling the national education standards. And we have found ways to do this through letting the play happen, observing, and then documenting it in relation to the standards. And there is a link at the bottom of this slide that you can check out later. And this has been a useful template for us.
And just to mention, documentation could be a whole nother webinar.
Yeah.
I wish we had more time, but this will be a little piece anyway.
And then to conclude with our work at Simons, one of the teachers we are working with sent us this email, and I'm going to read it to you because it's really beautiful. Today was my favorite day in the forest so far. Something about the spring equinox, full moon, almost losing our poor raven's nest, the magic of the ice. Through my work with you, I have felt my connection deepening each week. What a gift to be able to observe my children deepen their connection too. The children are really feeling ownership and kinship to this outdoor space. Another fun thing I'm noticing is how my inner voice is changing when assessing risk. When the children first joyfully made their way to the ice, I had to take a deep breath and say, they've got this. I have learned so much about reframing my language and making the kids an integral part of the risk assessment process. The sound of the ice was my favorite part today. They sounded like a bunch of little woodpeckers working away. I mean it when I say this is the best learning experience I have had in my career. So not only are the children thriving through this approach, and finding it meaningful, but many of the teachers are as well, which is really exciting.
So to summarize all of this and the outcomes, we said at the beginning, forest school is an outcome based, and that's why I've got it in quotations. But what we've come to realize that comes from this work through our experiences, as well as it's supported by the research, is that a forest school approach promotes healthy development in a stimulating learning environment. It really enhances the opportunity for play because of the access to loose parts, so lots of different pieces that don't have a preconceived way to use it. So the creativity really comes out. It encourages children to take appropriate risks and really learn the process of risk assessment and self-regulation. And it really fosters social skills. That's something that has been huge, particularly with our kindergarten group. They've noticed the difference with the peer group relations, as well as nurturing a connection to the natural world and a real understanding of environmental stewardship. So definitely through the research and our own experiences, this has been highlighted. So we quickly just wanted to share, and again, I know you can't access the links right now, but you'll have access to them a little later. If you wanted to learn more about our personal journeys with forest school, we have a few resources for that. We have a Facebook page where we post photos and our little stories from each day. So that's our form of documentation that does get shared with parents and teachers and the wider community. It's also a form of advertising and advocating for this type of work. So if you want to check out our stories, our Facebook link is there. I also write a blog called Forest Schools. I started this a few years ago when I was living in England. And the blog has a record of lots of stories of me learning and changing my perspectives and what this looks like in relation to interacting with the children. And so if you're interested in those stories, you can access the blog. And my master's project has been to create a book from these stories that will be coming out later this summer. So if that interested you, you can go to the website and sign up for the newsletter, and you'll get notified of when the book is ready. We also just wanted to share a few networks and training opportunities that we are aware of. There's definitely more than this, but we wanted to share what we know. It's important to really research what's happening in your local area first, because if you get a training or from somebody that's in a different country, the context, it might not translate as well as you might hope. So if you can find something that's near you, that's ideal. If you live in the Eastern United States, which is where we are right now, these are a few places, organizations and networks. And we also know in Canada, the Child and Nature Alliance, they offer Forest and Nature School practitioner training courses. In the United Kingdom, there's the Forest School Association that they don't offer training directly, but they're a network that you can plug into to learn more about it. There's also really good webinars on the NAAE, North American Association for Environmental Education, that talk about this work and particularly integrating it with public schools. So that's really helpful. And then if you have a network or a training or resources that you know about, please put it in the comments so that we can all learn from each other. I think that would be really helpful. So we asked you this at the very, very beginning, and we wanted to come back to it. We're wondering now, after having listened to us talk away for a while, if you have the same word, or if you might have a new word that comes to mind when you think of forest school. We'll give just a few seconds if you want to type anything in. And if not, that's okay too. We also realized we didn't share our word at the very beginning. We did that intentionally. And so we're going to share our words with you now, which my word is relationships.
And my word is connections.
So now we'd really love to offer up some time to answer these amazing questions. I've been trying to keep track. So how do you deal with Lyme checking and education for both children and parents? So there's definitely the risk of ticks in our region and then Lyme disease. And there are just things that we do to mitigate that risk. And one of that is we apply bug spray to the kids. And this can be DEET or non-DEET. We use non-DEET, but offer the option of DEET if parents prefer that. We have a lot of parent communication in advance. So sending out information about ticks, how to prevent the risk, or at least reduce the risk. We talk to the kids about it as well. We talk about if they find something on them to come and talk to us. We brush ourselves off at the end of a session. And for our sessions, we aren't with the kids all day. So we don't actually check for ticks ourselves, but that could be something if you are in a childcare position. But we talk to the parents about doing a thorough tick check as soon as the kids go home, because the risk is really if a tick has been there for more than 24 hours. So as long as we can check and make sure that we remove any ticks within a 24-hour period, the risk is much, much less. So it's definitely parent communication and then a few tools like bug spray and checking ourselves and brushing ourselves off. Yeah, so yeah, using art and drawing as a way of noticing. Absolutely, yeah, that's a great thing to do. How to get the support of parents. Yeah, well, this can be challenging. And it's public school system, it's a lot harder, I think. We run programs where parents sign their kids up, and that's a whole different story because they're already interested. They've already taken the bait. In a public school system, it's really about that communication and highlighting how it's going to benefit the learning process. So this can take a lot of time, and it really depends on where you are in the world and what the culture is like in your place.
And I know Tracy is from Cape Town, South Africa.
Oh, cool. Yeah. So if this isn't normal in your culture, it can be really hard to convince people that it's worthwhile. And it really, I'm grateful to those of you who are interested in this, who are in a place where maybe it's really hard, because you are forging the way. You are the leader in your area. There's a lot of national and international work going on about this. So sharing those, it's catching on like wildfire. It really is. So being able to share the articles and the networks and the training opportunities to communicate to people that this is a real legitimate form of education is our way to sort of keep plugging away and hopefully getting somewhere. But it does take time.
So it looks like there's one about story here. Which kind does your school prefer, from a tale or a real story about nature? So we've done all sorts of storytelling. We've done oral storytelling, stories that Caylin and I have just made up, and some of them have been kind of part of the emergent learning almost, or we were watching the children play and we see what they're interested in. And I have this one experience of we have this big hollow tree at our site, and the children think that snakes live in there, and they get all excited and they play all these games about snakes, and they're the snakes and they're friends of the snakes. And so I wrote a story about snakes, and part of it was very fictional because the snake talked, and part of it was a little bit of learning because it was wintertime and the children were wondering, are snakes out in the winter? Would they be in the snow? And so I embedded some learning about hibernation and all of that. So I think it can be a bit of both. We have also, at one point, we read a story that was written by an Indigenous woman, and we brought that to our programs to share with the children and share that this woman is not a woman from the past. We showed her a picture, and she's very much a living, present-day person, and that was really something that we wanted the children to take away with them.
So I just went to the next question about recommendations for how to connect children to the feeling that nature is our friend in just an hour or two. Whew. I don't know whether this means if you only see them for an hour or two and that's it, or whether it's an hour or two over a repeated basis. If it's repeated, it will come with time. That's something we've noticed in one of our groups, where the first weeks that we started going out, they were ripping the plants out just for no reason, or as part of their play without any thought to the damage that it was causing. And it's taken weeks and weeks of discussion and modeling. I think modeling is a really good tool, modeling your own relationship to the plants and the natural world, showing respect, gratitude, those pieces can really help. And bringing it up in discussion. We've had, for example, we have a group who really likes rough and tumble play, and there's a couple of hills that are at our site, and one of the hills is they just prefer to do the rough and tumble play there. And we've been asking questions and sort of pointing out, look at the difference between this hill and the other hill that's been left alone, and what's growing there and what's not on the one that you've been playing on. And they've started to recognize it. And I would say doing that in 1 to 2 hours once, I don't know, I don't have the answer to that. And that's why the regular repeated is so crucial, because it does take time.
Yeah, I think one other thing is letting the children teach each other as well, because there are some children within the programs, like the one I mentioned, who instantly was like, the partridge berry is our friend, and has become kind of an advocate of that, and will tell the other children to be careful around this plant. And so providing space for their voices and for them to be teaching each other to kind of back that up, back these children up as well, is important.
Yeah, that's a great example. So the next question is, how do you address making sure all of the students have appropriate clothing to be outside? This is one of the most challenging parts, actually, because particularly for us, and I'm sure many of you, in a climate that can have really harsh weather, it gets so cold and a lot of snow in the winter here. And one way we've tried is we've gone thrifting. We've found spare clothing in thrift stores for 25 cents sometimes, and provided some of that clothing ourselves. We do have some challenges with the public school program, because the kids do have some winter weather, but they don't have waterproofs. So there are times where we don't go outside at this point, and we only started this program in January. So when it rains, it can be a challenge for us, but we're actively working on applying for grants so that we can get waterproof clothing. So it's a mix of, if the parents are able to provide it, great, but not in a public school setting, not necessarily expecting that, and trying to find other ways. And I think that one option we're exploring is connecting with clothing companies and seeing if they'll make a donation. So just tapping into those resources, again, that are around you to see what you can get. And over time, as more and more donations may come in, you'll have hopefully enough to be able to provide for all children.
And I think as people get excited and enthusiastic about the programs, more and more people are going to come in and be like, oh, hey, I'll donate this. Well, one example is one of the paraprofessionals, or like teacher aides, noticed that a lot of the children were cold and they didn't have scarves or neck warmers. So she went home, she had some old fleece at her house, and she just quickly made up some neck warmers. And so all the kids in the class now have these beautiful, like, colorful neck warmers that they keep at school. And she was really excited to do that and be a help.
So the next question is asking forest school versus preschool kindergarten. So I'm assuming that means like a forest school versus a forest preschool or forest kindergarten. Great question. This is open to interpretation. There are actually Rachel Larimore, if you've heard of her, she's written some articles about what's the difference between forest school, forest preschool, nature preschool. So I would, I don't think we have a link to it, but I could find it. Highly recommend reading that to understand her perspective and more of a United States perspective on it. But I think the preschool kindergarten aspect is the early childhood. It tends to focus more on early childhood. And I use the term forest school because I'm not an early childhood educator. And a lot of my experience has been with school age children, particularly like 8 to 12. So it's, yeah, I can't fully answer the question when we have 3 minutes left, but that's the short version, I guess. Yeah. Let's see. Is forest school more doable in rural areas than urban areas? They come with different challenges. I think in a rural area, you may have more access to outdoor space, but then you may have more risks to navigate depending on where you are. In an urban space, finding a place, a natural area to go to can be a lot harder, and there may be more that you have to improvise with, and more partnerships that may have to be made. There's also ways to, CNAC, the Child and Nature Alliance of Canada, has a blog, and they have one blog post that I really liked about finding forest school in a schoolyard. And it's about a field where there's one tree or, maybe some bushes, and that it is a lot harder because you don't have the natural affordances or loose parts that a forest or other natural space provides. But you can implement the loose parts aspect by maybe bringing in some things that can inspire the play. So there are ways to use the ethos and philosophy, but in an urban area, and it's about getting creative with it. Okay. So do you find that emphasizing the 24-hour period reduces the fear for, this goes back to the ticks? I think that it can. I think it can, definitely. That communication about the realities around it can help alleviate fears. Yeah, definitely. Okay, working in a public school setting. Have you found parents wanting to be involved? Yeah, well, I think that you're absolutely right that parents can be the best advocates. And actually one of our programs, the after school program at a public school, started because a parent wanted her kid to have experiences outdoors and wasn't getting it during school. The school didn't provide after school programming at all. And so she was the one who got a group of people together, and I got pulled in because they knew that I had experience. And we sat down and had a meeting, and she said, I want this. And the program has now been running for over a year. So we also have in the public school kindergarten programs, a parent comes and volunteers every week because she loves it, and she's become a real source of donations and advocacy. And so involving the parents is a wonderful, wonderful option and resource. Well, necessary, really, yeah. I think. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and just quickly, I wanted to mention we've got our contact details and some more information about the environmental education program that we've been through. So please feel free to reach out. We don't have a website or Twitter account or Instagram account. We haven't quite got to that point, but we have a Facebook page and an email address, and you're more than welcome to get in touch with us.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you all.